Hey folks, so in this lecture, we are going to start moving out of the Renaissance period into what we call the early modern era. When we say the early modern era, we're talking about roughly the years 1600 to 1800. So this is sort of the end of the Renaissance period where people had put a lot more emphasis on Greek and Roman ways of thinking. So what sets the modern period apart from that? Well, here we've got King Henry VIII. So he was reigning in the mid to late 1500s. So one of the last kings of the Renaissance era in England. And one of the things that sets him apart, right, is vast expansions of royal power. Right, the idea of divine right of kings comes from Henry VIII. Now, he did issue in some social reforms like the Protestant Reformation in England, but he mostly did that so that he could maintain more personal power rather than having to yield any power up to the Catholic Church. So, even though he may have been behind some reforms in England, they were mostly things that benefited him, right? He wanted himself to be the head of the Church of England rather than the Pope being who's the head of the Roman Catholic Church. So, what's changing in this era? Well, Henry VIII is going to be one of the last kings that has unquestioned and unquestionable power in England and in the protectorates of England. What we start seeing in this early modern period, well, one thing is a rise of technology. So the firearm becomes more important. Now, in the Renaissance period, there were some cannons and there were some muskets, but they were, more used for intimidation factor than anything else. During the early modern period, we start getting muskets that are more reliable, that an ordinary, everyday person can use. And think about what this changes, right? So until then, until this point, wars were fought mainly with hand-to-hand weapons or bows. In either case, things that you needed an extensive amount of training with, right? Most of the people who would be able to conduct warfare are people who had dedicated their lives to it, right? The nobility, knights, professional soldiers, people who had spent a lifetime training in how to kill. Now, with the advent of the musket, theoretically, anybody can become an effective fighting person, right? Because all you have to do is put the musket in their hands and let it go. And yeah, the musket itself might not be accurate, but you get enough of them bunched together and it becomes a force to be reckoned with. So now we see the military power, the monopoly on violence, is not just concentrated within the royals and the nobilities anymore. More military power gets put into the hands of the common man. And in fact, the people that you see are part of the new model army will go on to fight in a revolution during the English Civil War against the ruling royalty. Now, it didn't quite stick, but it did drive home the idea that the common man has a lot more power in this era now. Also, the early modern era is when we start seeing the rise of the printing press. So, what does that mean? Well, until then, the only way that you had a book was if somebody had copied it down by hand, and it's because somebody else had copied it down by hand. That's mostly what the monks in the Middle Ages were doing, not so much creating new knowledge as preserving old knowledge, because anything that you wanted to keep publish in a book, you had to write down by hand, which meant most of the time monks were just sitting there scribing books that had already been written. And think about the errors that can come in from there, not just from translation, but if a monk's too sleepy and he uses the wrong word. With Gutenberg and the printing press, though, suddenly books are much more readily available. If you're interested in finding out what Jesus said about the poor, you don't have to listen to your priest or your parson tell you from the one copy of the Bible that's available in the village. Now you could potentially get a copy of the Bible yourself and read it for yourself, or get books about people who are living in other countries and realize, oh, hey, these aren't the barbarians we thought they were. They kind of think like you and me. We also see an increasing influence in the merchant class. So, with guilds and with other tradesmen gaining power, that means less power is concentrated within either the royals or the Roman Catholic Church. And so we have this sort of dissemination of knowledge and this wider dispersion of power, which means more and more people are willing to question some of the tenets that the Roman Catholic Church up at the time had assumed were unquestionable or beyond the common person to really reason about. Again, not saying anything about the doctrines of Catholicism itself, just talking about earthly power at this time. So, as more knowledge began to be accumulated and people began to understand that, just like Hippocrates and Galen back in the ancient world had thought, there are these parts of the brain that seem to be, uh, if not controlling the mind, at least associated with the mind, the thing that we call intelligence. But at the same time, most of these early modern scholars, even if they might reject the teachings of the Catholic Church, and even if they might reject organized religion as a whole, they still, by and large, have a belief in some kind of God and a belief in some kind of soul, which leads to this big debate, right? So if we're interested in natural processes, natural causes, natural effects, how do you explain the mind? It wasn't a big problem for Socrates or Aristotle or Plato. They wrestled with it a little bit, but they assumed that these things were all happening at this kind of supernatural level. So, what happens when you have a group of people who are questioning the church, but are also questioning the supernatural nature of the mind? How do we, in other words, resolve the mind-body problem? Is the mind part of the body, or is the mind something separate? So, one possibility here is dualism. Let's say you have you have the physical world and the mental world, and they're just completely separate, right? The physical world is real, the mental world is real, but they're two completely different phenomena. You can't mesh them. Compare that's a type of dualism, right? So we've been talking about dualism when it comes to Plato and St. Paul and many of the early Christian thinkers. Compare that to monism. So physicalism is a type of monism that says everything is the physical universe and our minds are just one aspect of that. So when we think about the part of our brains that are us or the part of our minds that are us, those are just very complicated physical interactions that might seem different from the physical world to you or I because we're the people with the minds, but are working according to the laws of physics and are working based on the known principles of science. On the other hand, some people might be monistic, meaning they don't see a divide between the mind and the body, but they believe in idealism. They say that the mental world is all that there really is, and the physical world is a manifestation of that. So why do we think fire is hot? Well, because we believe that it's hot, right? Why do we get burned if we put our hand on the stove? Because we believe that we're going to get burned. Why do we think that ice is cold? Because we believe that it's cold. And, this has been popular among some small circles at certain points in history, but I don't know that there's a lot of serious weight behind this idea, right? Because, I could think a snake's not going to bite me. If I pick up that snake, my belief might not stop it from biting me, right? This is my take on it anyway. And then the third part of monism is neutral that says, well, there's mind and there's the physical world, but there's something else altogether that is producing at the same time, both the physical world and the mind. Let me give you an everyday example of something like this that would explain this. Think about heat and what heat does to ice cream sales and the violent crime rate. The hotter it is, the more ice cream you sell, but also the more violent crime. Now, ice cream isn't causing violent crime, and violent crime isn't causing ice cream. They're both being caused by this third outside factor. So, for the thinkers who advocate neutral monism, the task is really to find out what that outside factor is. So, dualism here, you see the phrase Cartesian. Cartesian is referring to René Descartes. So you've probably heard this phrase, I think, therefore I am. Sometimes you see it rendered in Latin as cogito ergo sum. It means the same thing, I think, therefore I am. René Descartes was one of these early dualists in the early modern era, right? So dualism was quite old by that point, but Descartes was trying to infuse some new modern science into the idea of dualism. And he said, well, There's nothing in the world that we can be sure about, right? An authority might tell you that it's true, but the authority might be mistaken or lying. Our senses might tell us that something is there, but our senses might be mistaken because we're seeing an illusion, or maybe we're only seeing what we want to see. And so the only thing that we know for certain, according to Descartes, is that we're thinking, right? And that means an individual. So the only thing I, as an individual, really know is that I exist and I am thinking. So Descartes was very big into this idea of rationalism, right? Getting to the truth by thinking about things and getting to the truth by sort of logicking your way through it. So a firm believer in dualism. Now, he did make some important physical discoveries like reflexes, but he was really interested in this world of the mind and mentality. Now, Descartes believed that only humans had the power to think. And because only humans had the power to think, that meant that animals like cats and dogs and oxen and monkeys and what have you, well, they were more like a wagon or they were more like a shovel than they were like a human. And so this allowed Descartes to justify, doing experiments on animals instead of humans. So some of the experiments around this time, right, they would be things that we would consider quite cruel indeed, like vivisection. Vivisection is like dissection, only you're still alive when you're being opened up and observed, right? Viva, right? Alive when it's happening. Now, obviously, they didn't vivisect people at the time, even criminals, but it was considered okay to say vivisect a dog and watch its heartbeat, or vivisect a monkey and look at the way that its diaphragm worked. And I know that even just saying that might seem upsetting to some of us, and if you feel a little upset conjuring that image up, well, one, I sympathize with you, and two, it's because we're a product of the modern era, right, where we have maybe a little bit more compassion for animals than they would have during the early modern period, where people like Descartes just thought, you're all machines unless you're human. Now, another influential thinker at the time, Baruch Spinoza. So, unlike Descartes, who is coming from a background in Christianity, Spinoza was coming from a background in Judaism. So, he was from a Jewish family living in what we would now consider Portugal. And he was a firm believer in the existence of a God. Now, the way that he believed in God was a little bit different from what you would have seen in the traditional lines of Jewish thinking at the time. So he was actually sort of ostracized from his own synagogue in Portugal because they considered him to be an atheist. Now, was Spinoza an atheist? No, not by any means, but he believed in something called pantheism. Pantheism means everything is God, right? Pan meaning everything, and then theism meaning God. So he believed that the universe was a part of God. This chair that I'm sitting in was a part of God, and animals are a part of God, and this fork that I'm eating with is a part of God. So you and me, we're all definitely part of God. So for him, there was no real difference between the mind and the body. He said, hey, it's all part of God anyway, so why bother distinguishing it? Now, he believed in a kind of determinism called psychic determinism. This wasn't psychic in the way that you and I think about it now, like being able to have extrasensory perception. It just meant that he believed that behavior was caused by mental states. So why am I performing this action? Well, because of a mental state that I had prior to performing the action. That's what I mean by psychic determinism. So another important thinker at the time, Gottfried Leibniz. So, or probably Leibniz, right? EI in German, I think is Leib. So Gottfried Leibniz believed that, Descartes was a little bit right, Spinoza was a little bit right, but he rejected both of their explanations for what's going on. For Leibniz, the solution to the mind-body problem was that the mind and the body exist on different levels of a hierarchy. See, around about this time, the first microscopes were being developed by people like Van Leeuwenhoek and Anton Hook, I believe was the other guy, and that allowed people to start viewing microorganisms for the first time. And so when Leibniz began observing these microorganisms, he thought, oh, this is all part of a hierarchy, right? Little things, like little, you become littler and littler and littler. Now, there was a Greek thinker named Democritus who had a similar idea. And Democritus actually came up with the idea of atoms long before anybody could observe an atom. But Leibniz, instead of thinking about it in terms of material, right, not material atoms, he was thinking of them in terms of energy, which he called monads. And he said that, these monads are at different hierarchies. So our physical bodies are one kind of monad that are a little bit lower down the hierarchy. Our mental realm is another monad that's a little bit higher up. And way at the tippy top of the hierarchy, that's where you've got what we might think of as God. Now, Leibniz also believed that God, since God was at the top of the hierarchy, God was the one in control of everything. But this presents kind of a problem, because if you have God as the most organized, most in control, most sort of powerful form of energy out there in the universe, well, how do we explain the fact that we live in a world that had, murder and war and, pillaging and all kinds of crimes being done to all kinds of people, right? During this time, the early modern era, you see some of the most brutal wars in Europe that have taken place since the beginning of recorded history in Europe. For example, in the German states, there is the 30 Years' War, Protestant states fighting Catholic states, committing atrocities that had not been seen since the Crusades, right? So how do you resolve your idea that we're all living in a hierarchy and God is at the top when people are massacring entire cities in the name of their particular vision of Christianity? Well, Leibniz said, this isn't perfect, but that's because God is having to work with imperfect material, right? Now, God might be perfect, God might be powerful, but God's got to build a universe based on the monads that are lower down on the hierarchy. So, a perfect being trying to do the best that that being can with imperfect materials. So, Leibniz believed that God had created the best of all possible worlds. Now, it can't be completely perfect, according to Leibniz, because only God is perfect, and we exist at a hierarchical level that just isn't going to be perfect because we're not God. Compare that to Spinoza, who thought everything was God. So Leibniz said, wars happen, murders happen, all kinds of degradations happen, but this is the best version of that. Any other version of the world that could have possibly existed would have been even more violent, even more rapacious than the one we're living in right now. So this convinced some people, but others kind of saw this as a point of ridicule. So in a later lecture, we'll get into the Enlightenment era, starting with about the 1800s. And one of the key figures in the Enlightenment era was this guy named Voltaire. So Voltaire also believed in God, but he believed in a deistic God, a God who did not get involved in the world at all. And he believed that, Leibniz's ideas are just ridiculous, right? So if you look at the world around us, if you look at the 30 Years' War, it's impossible in Voltaire's mind to believe that this is the best that we can do, right? That there's no way for us to improve the world, and we just have to live with this shocking violence and degradation just because, hey, that's the way the world is, and this is the best way that it can be. Voltaire thought we got to be able to do better than this. So Voltaire wrote a novel called Candide, and Candide is basically one big satire of Leibniz's idea that we're in the best possible world. There's a character that's sort of the main character's advisor, Dr. Pangloss. Pangloss here, again, that word pan meaning everything. There's a guy who glosses over everything, just like Voltaire thought that Leibniz was doing when he talked about the best of all possible worlds. So in Candide, there's part of the 30 Years' War happening, all kinds of brutal sectarian violence. There's a scene in it where people are starving to death, and they literally, I'm not making this up, I'm not trying to be crude, in the novel, they literally have to cut off their own butts and eat their butts in order to not starve to death. And this is a world where Dr. Pangloss, who's the surrogate for Leibniz, says, we're living in the best of all possible worlds. Well, that's it for the mind-body problem for right now. When we come back, we'll start talking about some of the philosophical concepts that were going on in England at the time, and we'll start with the British empiricists who wanted to discover the world through direct interaction with it. All right, and that's where we'll pick up next.